Welcome, welcome, friends and comrades of the Midwestern Marx Institute. Today we have a very special broadcast. I'm going to be talking with my good friend Marius Trotter, who's a commentator on history, philosophy, politics, and all things in between. A brilliant writer, someone who's written some of my the favorite articles we've had an opportunity to publish at the Midwestern Marx Institute. And today we're going to be touching on a quite controversial topic. He just wrote an excellent article on Iran's Islamic Socialism, making the argument that Iran is indeed a socialist country. So we'll tease out some of the arguments in that article, talk about the Iranian experience, the Iranian trajectory, the role that Iran plays today in the up and coming multipolar world, in the axis of resistance, and much more. So stick around. We'll bring him in after the international. You're not going to want to miss this one. All right. Thank you so much, Comrade Marius, for joining us.
Great to be here.
Before we start talking about the microphone might have disconnected. Before we start talking about some of the arguments that you unfold in your excellent article, can you sort of situate us in the history of, I think, 20th century Iran? As you mentioned in the piece, it's a country that had some of its major resources, specifically oil, basically colonized for 2/3 of its history, first by England from 1914 to 51, and then, of course, by the U.S. After the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 53, and that would last, of course, until 79 with the Iranian Revolution. So can you tell us a little bit of that history of first British colonialism, Mossadegh, and the overthrow?
Yeah, sure. So the thing to understand about Iran is that, like Ethiopia and Thailand, it was never formally colonized. It was never like outright annexed or ruled over by a foreign colonial power. However, it was subjected to economic neocolonialism, and so the British first got into Iran, then called Persia, in really the late 19th century, but really in a big way in 1901, when British speculators found oil in Abadan in southern Iran in 1901. And then around, I believe, 1913, 1914, they basically got a no-bid exclusive contract to to exploit the oil reserves there. And they set up this company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was pretty much completely under their control. And yeah, they held this monopoly on the oil wealth until 1951, extracted an enormous amount of wealth out of Iran, and then in 1951, there was this nationalist leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was elected, elected the president of Iran. And one of the first things he did was move to nationalize these oil reserves because not only out for nationalist reasons, but because it was an important part of developing Iran into a modern nation, and Iran was being hobbled, by the fact that the British were controlling this vital resource. And long story short, both British and American intelligence organized a coup against Mossadegh and backed the Shah, the monarch of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, and then for about 26 years afterwards, there was a brutal dictatorship, U.S.-backed dictatorship under the Shah. However, I would say that one thing that did change was um, that there was a shift, though, from British domination to American domination after this period, because the British were unable, after World War II, the British were unable to assert their hegemony in the same way they had before World War II. And so ultimately, it came down to the CIA to really take the lead in regime change. And so they were the ones that were sort of able to dictate terms. And so after the 1950s, Iran nominally had control over its oil reserves, but American companies got very favorable, terms in terms of like access to it, as well as West German companies and others. And so it was that situation that fed this sense of national humiliation in Iran, a sense of subjugation to Western powers, and was definitely um, one of a major impetus behind the Iranian Revolution that occurred in 1979. I do want to make the one point is that as bad as this exploitation was, um, the uh, foreign interests were largely interested in oil in Iran and not much else, because that's the big commodity to trade on the international market. And so, even though foreign imperialists exploited their oil, they didn't interfere so much in other aspects of Iran's economy, which is really important because, as I explain in the article, the imperialists did not interfere in Iran's internal economic life to the extent that, say, the British did in India or Egypt or other places, where you had things like the cotton market, which involved, widespread changes in the agricultural system and the very way that they produced food and so on. So I make this point. I make this point to illustrate the fact that a lot of Iran's economic structure that it had had for centuries before Western domination existed, a lot of that, even with foreign interference, remained intact, even through the period of the Shahs, which kind of explains why, in part, explains why Iran has taken such a different path, not just from other countries in the global South, but from many other countries in the Middle East. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the period of the Shah as being a dictatorship. You would think that, in accordance with what the liberals post on Twitter, that it was a heaven on earth, a paradise where women
Yeah.
were able to celebrate their birthday, right? They
Yeah.
can't do that after 79, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, can you? One of the interesting things that I found in your article, and I'd like you to tease out a little bit more, is that you mentioned that in the 2000 plus year-long history of Persian/Iranian civilization, there's never really been a general dominance of free market practices. There's always been strong state intervention for the sake of some notion of social/common good. And even in a more feudal context, or a more aristocratic context, um, the if you could even call it the feudal lords, they never really functioned in a way that's similar to how those similar, akin, homologous class positions would function in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the distinctive characteristics of this civilization and the role that the state has played in the economy all throughout?
Yeah. So ancient Persia had what you could call a so-called palace economy. And this has been described. Many archaeologists have talked about this kind of model. This model also existed in ancient Egypt, in many ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. You've even published articles by Michael Hudson, who kind of goes into some of this. A lot of ancient Near Eastern civilizations, whereby the vast bulk, because it was such a powerfully centralized state around a monarchy, the vast bulk of resources went to the king or the imperial bureaucracy, and then they redistributed resources as they saw fit. So, in a sense, the palace was planning the economy, and this is very different from from feudalism. Much feudalism in a lot of feudal Europe or feudal Japan, where you had, in those cases, you had a monarch that was very weak and was dependent on, localized barons and nobility for political support. And the nobles were supposed to raise armies for the king, but day to day they had, a lot of control over their fiefdoms. In this case, in the Persian system, like actually with the Pharaoh of Egypt, you had a nobility, but the king was the emperor was so much wealthier and more powerful than any of the nobility that they effectively did not have real political independence to the extent that you had elsewhere. Also, Persia had feudalism much earlier than Europe. They had it all the way, I think, about over 2,000 years ago. They had feudalism. Slavery was abolished very early in their history. So there was a very, I'm not trying to glamorize it or idealize it. It was an extremely autocratic system, don't get me wrong, and one with stark class differences. But it functioned differently. It functioned differently than the feudal system as we think of it, in Europe and even other parts of the Middle East. So I think that's an important distinction to make, that one of the reasons that you can say that Iran has been able to transition, not even really transition, to a planned economy so effectively is that it's such a deeply rooted part of their history, that the state plays a very large role in the economy. Therefore, it's not something that until fairly recently was something that was even discussed, politically. It was just sort of assumed that this is how it was done. Now, planned by who and for what ends, of course, is up for contention, right? But I mean, like, I even read this one account that made the point that a lot of markets weren't even introduced until in Mesopotamia, until there was this very famous incident called Xenophon's March to the Sea, where there were these Greek mercenaries. This is in 401 BC. There were these Greek mercenaries that fought in a Persian civil war for hire. They backed the losing side, and then they had to march, all the way through Mesopotamia back to basically Greece, all the way to the Black Sea. That was the sea that they were marching towards. And so they would go through these Mesopotamian Persian towns, and they had coins, and they didn't have anything physical to barter with, and just at basically spear point, they demanded that people accept the coins as payment, and thus coinage and markets in a monetary sense that we would understand were introduced, by military means in some of these societies. But just the idea that this was not something that was their accustomed, practice. Everything, to the extent that there were any markets, very small, very local scale, very much based on the barter system. But most macroeconomics was done at the level of the monarchy, basically. Anyway.
Yeah, you introduce a very interesting dilemma, which is that, I mean, partly in the West and mainstream economic thinking, whether you see it in figures like Hayek or others. You see this clear dichotomy of societies between market or free market based societies and planned economies. And it's unfortunately one that I think that a lot of people on the more orthodox understanding of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism accept it. They
Yeah.
assume that markets met capitalism or class society, and planning met socialism. So you introduced this interesting question about like what is the concrete character of the planning, because we have a whole lot of planning right now in capitalism, but it's for whom and towards what end? Well, it's for the capitalist class, and they're the ones that plan. What was like the character of the planning in sort of Persian civilization? Was it something that had a guidance towards the common good, or is that something that like introduces itself with the development of the Muslim religion, or how what was planning done for and towards what end? Does it mirror the sort of planning forms that we've seen in previous class societies of the West, where it's in part for the sake of accumulation, not in the form of capital, but in different forms for whatever classes at the helm of society at the top? So what form did planning take in this civilization?
Well, I don't want to go too far into the weeds about this because we're talking about 2,500 years of history, and Iranian and Persian history is very deep and very complex. So I do not present myself as an authority on this in any means. My main focus is on, the Iranian Revolution mostly and its aftermath, and also its sort of what led up to it. But in a general sense, I would say the purpose of planning was because you just had a very powerful monarchy that was overseeing a very well structured state, like Babylon was, like Assyria was, like Egypt was, like Imperial China, was, with uh, well a very well established sort of imperial bureaucracy. And I mean, the main purpose was not, for social good. It was to hold together this, in some cases, a very large empire with in certain cases a lot of subjects who had often very little in common besides allegiance to a particular monarch. So um, I'm not at all trying to say that that is socialism. It certainly is not. Um, all I'm saying is that the fact that you had this sort of very ancient, you had this very long-standing model that existed, and unlike in other places in Asia, um, it was not as interfered with by foreign imperialism as other places were. So therefore, this sort of pre-colonial history is a lot more relevant to understanding, the modern day, where all across Asia and Africa, a lot of old productions, modes of productions, were turned upside down because of the violent intrusion of colonial capitalism. You know, so while Iran was penetrated by imperialists, it was not to the same degree. It was just enough to humiliate Iranians and wound their national pride and instigate, resistance, but it wasn't enough that it fundamentally altered their society, in the way that altered many other places. And so that's, I think, very important to understand when understanding why the Iranian system has developed the way it has to the present.
I want to go back to um, something you tease out about the period of the return of the Shah from
Mm-hmm.
53 to 79. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, in many ways, right, a puppet of U.S. imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
But you seem to say that there's a somewhat of a rational kernel there, because there's a process of modernization that begins to take root then, which brings with it, because of the context, right, a
Mm-hmm.
series of contradictions and inequalities in terms of development. which parts of society actually benefited from that modernization. And this produces, of course, the uprising in 79, the revolution of 79. Can you tell us a little bit about that period of the Shah, some of the contradictions, and how it lays the groundwork for the 1979 revolution? And what are the class
Yeah,
forces that carry it forth?
sure, sure. And yeah, I mean, I would say that something that's not understood. So the Shah obviously is a brutal U.S. backed, absolute monarch. Um, he was clearly, an egomaniac, and um, broached no reform except ones that he approved of. But at the same time, the Shah wanted he wanted his monarchy to be as strong as possible, and he wanted Iran to be a relevant force in a rapidly changing modern world. And he was afraid, and so he unleashed a. So starting in the early 1960s, he implemented a series of reforms that were called the White Revolution, starting in 1963. White because white was the color of the monarchy, and also because he said this is a bloodless, change in Iranian society. But white was also, they had another meaning. White was supposed to be in contrast with the two revolutions that the Shah wanted to avoid, either a red revolution led by the communists or a black revolution led by the Islamists, and the clergy, obviously wore black. So, what was the White Revolution? What was the content of it? Well, part of it was a series of land reforms in the countryside, which redistributed land, small plots of land to the peasantry, and broke up the estates of these big landowners. And this essentially ended the sort of remnants of feudalism that existed in rural Iran. And the Shah didn't do this out of benevolence to the peasants. He did this because he wanted to break the power of the landed nobility and make sure that they were not any kind of politically independent class, that challenged in many ways. And he compensated them by giving them certain businesses in the cities, therefore moving them closer to him and easier to, control and buy them off. So basically, there was no independent power base that they had anymore in the countryside. And then, in addition to that, the Shah also, um, reinvested some of the massive amounts of oil revenue that was coming in into building up independent manufacturing, building roads, building railways, all these things to both centralize the monarchy, make Iran into a more modern state, and moreover, enable Iran to build up a modern military, so that Iran could be a significant military power in the Middle East. Um, so, uh, so the Shah did all that. Most of it was, and I mean, and there were significant gains. I note that, like, for example, in 1960, Iran produced basically no steel of its own in 1960, and by 1977, it was producing about as much steel as Britain. So that's a very significant change. There was an explosion in urbanization. There was there were roads and railways connecting the major cities for the first time. So in many ways, Iran, was entering the 20th century. You know, um, However, the uh, the flip side of it, though, is that only a very small number of people were actually benefiting from these changes. Uh, there was there was a bourgeoisie that grew in Iran at this time, but it was very small. As I note in the article, um, 85% of all private industry was controlled by 45 families. It was a very tiny elite. There was this middle class that grew, especially in the civil service, but they were only about 5% of the population. Um, at the time of the Iranian Revolution. And although the peasant had their own plots of land, they weren't provided machinery, tools, seed, any kind of public support to make their farms, successful. And even though there was this growth of industry, there was, of course, extreme exploitation of workers, both by the small Iranian bourgeoisie and also by foreign imperialists. So, you know, so the Shah presided over all these major changes and dislocated, many people and altered Iranian society. With but in the process of doing so, he created these growing classes of people, both the urban working class, the semi-emancipated peasantry, only semi-emancipated peasantry, and even significant parts of the petty bourgeoisie and the middle class, who were, even if they weren't destitute, were discontented by his autocracy, his autocratic form of rule, the use of the Savak, the political, the secret police against political dissidents, and lack of liberal political reforms. So, so all these things, all these sort of tensions mounted, and the Shah was not very astute about cultivating a large enough class of people that had a stake in the monarchy, and he ended up having a huge number of enemies and not many allies.
What would you say then was the class character of 1979? And
Yeah.
I mean, some of the things that happened after 79, the nationalization of key industries, economically very akin to the period of Mossadegh. Is there like a turning back towards seeing Mossadegh as a reference point at all, or what's the relationship of 79 to the period of 51 to 53 with Mossadegh?
Yeah, I'm not, like I said, this is a very complicated topic, but I would say that the Iranian Revolution was like, it was a social explosion that's hard to describe. It has very few parallels in modern history, because there were very wide stratas of Iranian society that were fed up with the Shah, and it all sort of just came together at once. So the urban industrial working class despised him. There was mass discontent among the peasants. There were significant parts of the middle class and the petty bourgeoisie that were unhappy with him. So essentially, in the very beginning, it was a very broad alliance of forces that rose up against the Shah in 1978 and 1979, and ideologically very diverse. I mean, Islamists, and you also had liberals, and you had Marxists. The only thing that wedded them together was that they wanted to get rid of the monarchy. And then for about a year or so afterwards, there was this kind of there was this sort of uncertain period when it wasn't clear what exactly was going to take the Shah's place. The Shah fled into exile, and then much of the bourgeoisie fled the country. Because the Shah had intentionally kept the bourgeoisie so weak and depended on him, personally, and the monarchy as an institution. Once the monarchy fell, much of the bourgeoisie was done for, and they just left. And a lot of them went to Los Angeles, where they've been ever since. But there was an important figure. There was I believe he was the president or prime minister in the year or so afterwards. His name was Bani Sadr, and he sort of represented, he kind of represented the sort of middle class liberal forces in Iranian society. But as it became clear that the West was hostile to the new order in Iran, the more radical elements of the Islamists, got more and more popular support. And the fact is that in terms of a working class base, the Islamists, led by this radicalized, politicized clergy, prevailed because they had overwhelming popular support among both the workers and the farmers and the rural farmers, who were overwhelmingly not just very impoverished but very religious. And for them, their opposition to the Shah was about economic exploitation, was about the humiliation of foreign domination, but it was also the fear that Western domination would be a threat to their traditional religious and social and cultural values. And this is a very important motor force in understanding, how the Iranian Revolution transpired. And honestly, it's something that also took a lot of Marxists by surprise, including Iranian Marxists, which is something I'll go into later. So anyway, to answer your question, I think there was it was a very broad cross section of class forces that toppled the Shah, but it became, within about a year or two, became very, very clear that the people with the popular support and the legitimacy and the support of the masses, including the working class masses, especially the politicized Shia populists, Islamists, were the ones in the best position to take power. And of course, the most well-known face of this is the Ayatollah Khomeini, but there's a number of other clerics that are extremely important. And and I think that was sort of the direction it went. And I think it took a lot of the liberals and the Marxists were taken by surprise, because the presumption that they always had was that when the political crisis subsided, that the clerics would retreat from politics and return to their mosques, and which didn't happen. The clerics decided to take a very active political role, and that was very surprising. And they had this enormous popular base. I mean, like, one thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about the Iranian Revolution is the level of popular participation. I mean, they think it's estimated that about 10% of Iran's entire population, at least, maybe more, directly participated in the mass protests that brought down the Shah. By contrast, maybe 2 or 3% of the population of Russia directly participated in the initial Bolshevik Revolution. Similar numbers for the French Revolution. You had situations where
which is where that narrative, like, if you get 3% of the population to hit the streets, you're almost guaranteed a revolution, right?
Yeah, this is way above that.
Yeah.
And you have these incredible situations where completely unarmed crowds. I mean, the Shah had this very heavily armed military, right? All the best weapons from the Americans and the Europeans and so on. And you had situations where you had almost completely unarmed crowds overwhelming entrenched military positions, because they just overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. Like, they mowed down maybe hundreds of people, and they would still get overwhelmed, because it would be like maybe a couple hundred or a couple thousand soldiers against hundreds of thousands of people, So, I mean, the popular character, which was overwhelmingly working class, of this revolution, cannot be denied. And so I think that's a thing that's really, it behooves, Marxists to take this seriously. Thinks a lot of Marxists sometimes get dismissive of it because it's not of an ideology that they agree with. But it's a very hard case to say that the working class of Iran did not support these changes. I think that's very difficult it's very difficult to try to make that point.
Right. And I mean, the most important thing for communists, I would say, is our world view, dialectical materialism. And one of the few instances where Marx and Engels say communism is, what they say is communism is the real movement of history, which abolishes the present state of things. And that's certainly what happened in 79, right? The Iranian people regained their sovereignty. It might have not been through a proletarian dictatorship or something, or through the two-day party, but there were forces that were able to break with a past that caused humiliation, like the similar humiliation that China had experienced for a century, humiliation of being subservient to foreign interest. You kind of you kind of provided a good segue for my next question when you spoke about how surprised even the West was when how long the clergy stayed in a position of political power, or in a, yeah. What sort of happens after 79 in terms of both, like, nationally? Is the nationalization of key industries something that's immediate? Um, and internationally, what's the reaction of, like, the U.S.? Right now, everyone recognizes that Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries on the planet. Has that been a reality since 79? Was that the reaction of the U.S. After the Iranian Revolution, or is that something that occurs somewhere along the way?
It's a complex topic, but I would say that yes, overall the reaction of the West was very hostile, very early on, because the Shah had been a pillar, of U.S. imperialist domination in the Middle East. He was a guarantee. He was a sort of this bulwark against revolutionary nationalism in the region, and he had been loyally supporting, their initiatives in the region. I mean, for example, there was a communist rebellion in Dhofar in Oman against the Sultanate of Oman, who was a British puppet. The Shah of Iran sent troops to help crush this communist uprising. Um, the Shah over and over again, was this pillar that they had depended on for like 20 years. And so to just see his monarchy just completely crumble, and then this sort of frightening and unfamiliar government just take over, which obviously was not friendly to the West at all. Certainly, there was hostility from the outset. Um, uh, there were some attempts by British intelligence to try to make nice with the new regime, because it was anti-West, but they were also anti-communist. And their slogan from the outset was neither West nor East, and so there were some initiatives by the West to try to make, quietly, to try to make nice with the new government. But I think it became clear after a few years that that was not going to happen. And then you had the hostage crisis, and all of that turned, American and a lot of Western public opinion against the Islamic Republic from the outset. Now, with regards to the economy, I think what's really important to understand is that within only about a year or so of the Shah being overthrown, there was this war with Iraq, that occurred. Uh, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons for it. That's a whole other topic in and of itself. But the fact that they had to be on war footing and mobilized for a war, um, created a situation where there wasn't much space for private enterprise. So, like, just from the outset, they had to pivot toward a planned economy and centralized production and efficient production for the war. And so that definitely turned things toward a state sector. And then in addition, there was, as I already said, there basically was, there was very little of a bourgeoisie, you know. So you essentially had the centralized state, which was no longer run by the monarchy, but by these highly politicized, clerics. And even though they were denouncing communism, rhetorically, they rejected communism because obviously they associated communism with atheism, which is anathema, right? And yeah, Iran became very much a state-directed economy. I don't know whether you'd call it socialist, but definitely a war economy, from like 1980 to 1988. And these were the crucial years when the Islamic Republic was consolidating itself as a government. And the fact that they were under attack by a foreign enemy definitely helped build even more mass support for rallying around the Islamic system, which might have been a lot more difficult if you couldn't appeal to patriotism. So that's my basic answer to that question. However, I should say this is when the war ended in '88, Iran was in a very bad position because not only were they exhausted by the war, suffered huge casualties and damage to parts of their country. Um, they were also in a very dire economic situation because they were so isolated from from most of the world. They weren't really aligned with either camp. They weren't aligned with the Soviets. They kind of had pissed the Soviets off by repressing the Tudeh party, the Communist Party, um, and then they weren't really, they weren't on good terms with the West either. So they were kind of in this very unfavorable situation where they didn't have many trading partners. So and 80 and at the end of the 80s and into the 90s, Iran moved into a more neoliberal direction and made certain market reforms. Um, and then later in the 2000s, actually during Ahmadinejad, they actually turned away from neoliberalism and toward the more state-centric economy. And I won't go further afield, but this is a trend you see in Iran a lot, is that they kind of go back and forth, a bit in terms of their economic uh, directions, But throughout, there's a very strong tendency of emphasizing um, centralized state-run economy. And while there has been initiatives toward privatization, it's mostly been cases of out of expediency, not really out of ideological commitment, which is the same you could say for many communist states too have done that under certain circumstances. So
Yeah, that was excellent. I want to shift to talking specifically about, I guess, the most polemical point in the article, which is that Iran is a form of Islamic socialism. Now, of
mhm.
course, Marxism doesn't have full ownership over the term socialism. There's been a long
Mhm.
history of socialist traditions before
Mhm.
Marxism, and I think you kind of hint at a utopian socialist character in part that might be embedded within this Islamic socialism that is in Iran. And I want to bring up these two comments because these are frequent reactions on the left when
Mhm.
one talks about Iran. This is from Zumas. Iran is not socialism, it's fascist. They believe in class collaboration and class unity. Well, you know
Mhm.
who actually also believed in class collaboration? It was the utopian socialists.
Mhm.
The path that they saw towards creating this utopian community outside of capitalism was one that required a collaboration with progressive capitalists to fund those utopian
Mhm.
communities. And Jason Kukulo, interesting name. War economy does not mandate socialism, fascism, and Nazis employ war economies in peacetime, which is
Okay.
true. But I don't think Marius's argument
Well,
is necessarily making
yeah.
that point. So, how would you reply to those two things and begin to structure how it is that you formulate Iran being a form of Islamic socialism?
Yeah, I mean, this is, obviously this is controversial. But I would say, with regards to the war economies, like I said, I literally actually just said that war economy does not equal socialism. Um, but then he said war economy in peacetime. Well, Iran was not doing this in peacetime. Iran was doing this in the immediate aftermath of a violent revolution and then a war, an extremely bloody war, which hundreds of thousands of their people died. So it was a very urgent imperative of theirs to centralize the economy. I also don't agree that all war economies are fascistic. I mean, the United States during FDR, had a very centralized war economy. Is that fascistic? Um, France during the French Revolution, you know, uh, they had a special name for their sort of state directed economy, but they had an economy where like the state would subsidize certain things for the sans culottes and and so on. Is that fascistic? I mean, really, um, that isn't to me the central thing that defines fascism. It can be a feature of it, but I don't see that as necessarily um, fascism. And also with regards to class collaboration, well, a lot of communist, in a lot of revolutions, even communist movements have collaborated with forces that are not necessarily exclusively proletarian. The Chinese communists have, in addition to the proletariat and the peasantry, have collaborated with, the progressive-minded intelligentsia, the national-minded bourgeoisie, things like that. So I think, people making these statements of class collaboration is fascism. That sounds very pithy on Twitter, but that doesn't actually describe a lot of these concrete situations very well. And of
Because it was
course,
an imperialized country, right? And
yeah,
an imperialized country subject to neocolonialism, as you mentioned, for almost a century, right?
yeah,
The collaboration of progressive classes that want sovereignty in that context has very little to do with the sort of class collaboration that would take root in the imperialist center,
right,
that
yeah,
would be, a central component of fascism, right?
yeah, right. So I mean, I think we have to go beyond sloganeering and look at what you know is the actual driving motivation and the driving force in a lot of these, how this is implemented. And so, if I may, I would like to talk a little bit more, concretely about what I mean about, Islamic socialism, because um, there's a really good book by this guy called Mazahiri, who's Iranian. He's a correspondent for Press TV, and his book is called. It was published only a few years ago. It's called Socialism's. I have it right here. Yeah, socialism
Mhm.
ignored success. Yeah, Iranian Islamic socialism. And he really goes into a lot of detail about the institutions in Iranian society that make it a socialist system. Yes, it's a very good book. I recommend that people uh, read it. Um, and it's actually funny. On a little side note, what's interesting is that he wrote that book because it started with him getting in as an Iranian, getting into debates with Western Marxists, particularly Trotskyists, who were apoplectic from people from the World Socialist website, who were apoplectic at the suggestion that Iran could possibly be a socialist system or socialistic. And he decided, that he wanted to write a book, and what that book is very good because it talks about Iran's system in a sort of language that is familiar to people familiar with the Marxist discourse. So there's a couple of institutions that are, in my view, socialistic, or at least non-capitalist, in Iran's system. So the first one that I list in the article is called, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, the Bonyats, and this is this is very interesting. It doesn't really have much parallel in other countries. These are essentially Islamic charity organizations, which are run as cooperatives, and they provide social services and welfare and a sort of a safety net for Iran's working classes, and they're usually administered by religious clergy. Um, so they are not officially state sector because the state the state subsidizes them. The state gives them money, but then it doesn't really direct them what to do with it, day to day. It's at the discretion of the clergy on how to distribute it and how to use it. But they're not. This is all supposed to be about, in line with your Islamic obligation to provide for the poor. Zakat, charity. And so a lot of people would say, okay, well, big deal. There's a lot of capitalist countries that have welfare programs. But what makes this, I think, different is how prominent it is in Iran's economy. It's about something like 20 to 30%, so as much as maybe a third of Iran's entire economy consists of these bonyats. When you consider the size of Iran, when you consider the amount of oil revenue they have, this is an enormous, part of their economic life, and most of these bonyads run at a loss. and yet the state continues to subsidize them. And they employ millions of Iranians. Millions of Iranians work for these cooperative enterprises. And actually, the biggest Bonyad, I note, is it's called the it's the single largest holding company in the entire Middle East, and it consists of the personal properties of the Shah, which were expropriated after the revolution. And I think one of the things that's very telling about the character of these enterprises is that the Western neoliberal business press, as well as the Iranian opposition, hates these institutions. They don't have a single good thing to say about them. They are always talking about how these bonyads are bloated, they're inefficient, they're providing work to a lot of people. They're just providing jobs to people for no reason than to just provide jobs to them. They're not productive. They're inefficient, which honestly sounds a lot like the way the Western business press talks about the state-owned enterprises in China. They're like, why are you propping up these unprofitable, institutions? Excuse me. But the point is that, so in capitalist terms, it doesn't make sense as to why so much of their economy is being is taken up by these institutions. But if the purpose of it is social, then it makes perfect sense, which is to me a very strong indication that a very large part of Iran's economy is directed towards social ends, which to me is a fundamental component of socialism. I mean, it's literally in the word. And yeah, of course, it's not justified in Marxist terms, but it's justified in Islamic terms, But that to me, it just comes down to the cultural context, that this operates in. So that's one. So that's one major aspect to me that is socialistic, and if someone can argue to me that this is somehow some sort of capitalist thing, or at least a normal capitalist thing to do, I'm all ears. So is it okay if I keep going?
Yeah. I want to emphasize that point that you just made. Like, an institution such as this is completely unthinkable to the scale that it has been achieved in Iran, in a capitalist society, in a capitalist mode of life. In a capitalist mode of life, the bottom line, the interest that's raised to the level of supremacy is capital and its accumulation. Having an institution like this that sometimes functions at a loss and then gets, continuously propped up by the government, it defies the logic of the capitalist mode of life. It might not be, something you can point back to in Marx, Engels, or Lenin's text and say, it's what they described as the dictatorship. No, but it's society working for society itself, which is the most basic definition for socialism. And Marx and Engels never gave us a blueprint. It would have been against their worldview to give us a blueprint. Maybe this is the route that a civilization that has had these religious influences as such a core part of its identity, maybe this is part of the route that socialism in this context takes. So again, just for people to keep their minds open and see how it is that if we judge it by the logic of capital, it couldn't be more incompatible.
Yeah, right. So that's one aspect, and then there's this other very interesting institution in Iran that it's called the Basij. And when a lot of the Western media talks about the Basij, they talk about it like it's just a pro-government militia, which it is that, but it's way more than that. It's a very pervasive institution in Iranian society. So to explain what the Basij is, it was first created during the war with Iraq, where they set up these local councils on a community, village, and neighborhood level to like organize the defense of the country, basically, and to mobilize the regular population to defend the country, not just the actual army. But then the Basij continued to exist after the war, and in addition to the military component defending the Islamic Revolution from its enemies, both external and internal, the Basij have also taken on all these other functions: community service, running schools, health clinics, infrastructure construction and repair, cultural activities, cultural centers, even disaster relief, a whole myriad of functions. Um, and uh, the mandate is that it's a community. There are these community level councils and their mandate is to serve the Iranian masses and defend the principles of the Iranian Islamic Revolution. Um, and it's the joining it is not mandatory, but there are social benefits and other benefits to being a member. And what's incredible about it is the scale of like the membership of these Basij. Iran's entire population is about 90 million people, and there is as many as 25 million people in these Basij. It's a huge part of the population. Um, and each one of these councils has a quote base at a neighborhood or village level. There are tens of thousands of these bases all over the country. And in each base, there could be as few as 10 people. In other bases, there could be hundreds or thousands of people. Um, and this is, I think, the point where the socialist aspect comes in. The people who make up these councils are overwhelmingly from the working class. And about a third are women. And contrary to popular belief, it's not only Muslims that are in these Basij. There are Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians who can join the Basij as well. And the only requirement is that you agree with the principles of the Iranian Islamic Revolution. And this leads to my other point, which is that everyone who's in the Basij is trained, ideologically. They have classes in the Quran. They study the works of, key thinkers of the Iranian Revolution, the struggle in Palestine, all these other things. So this is a very important way that the government remains connected at a grassroots level with the masses. And if you strip away the ideology, the ideological veneer, in terms of its actual function, they're very similar to the committees for the defense of the revolution in Cuba. They're very similar to the Bolivarian circles in Venezuela. They're very similar to the Soviets in Russia. The fact that it has a different ideology doesn't change the fact that these are overwhelmingly working class institutions, and they connect the leadership with the masses on a regular day-to-day basis to ensure that the revolution keeps going, and doesn't stagnate, from the leadership becoming disconnected with the common people, which is unfortunately what happened, in the Soviet Union and other places. But one other aspect that I didn't actually bring up in my article, is that they run economic institutions too. They run banks, which are forbidden by Islamic law for lending at interest. There's a bunch of enterprises that they run along these communalistic, Islamic populist, principles. So it's both an important revolutionary institution, a military institution, ideological institution, and it's also emphasizes the popular and working class character of the government that it supports. The government in Iran could not have survived as long as it has without this level of popular support. And I go on to say that if you really think about it, Not only are they that, in a sense, the Basij is kind of the equivalent of the Communist Party, in terms of the mass organizations that exist in China, DPRK, Cuba, Vietnam. And then sort of the clergy are kind of like the Politburo and like the vanguard, you know. But but yeah, so I mean that's another I think aspect because of course an objection you often get is, well, state ownership, that doesn't mean socialism in and of itself. And I agree. There's a lot of countries with state ownership, they're not socialist. But this kind of direct connection with the working class and this constant mobilization of the working classes and the working masses, um, to be actively involved in defending the revolution, defending the popular and anti-imperialist aspects of the Iranian system. Um, I think that aspect is socialistic. It's not just some commands from above, or just nationalizing some industry here and there. There's a real give and take and popular participation, in this system. Of course, is it imperfect? Sure, it always is. But I don't think you can so easily overlook this working class foundation, of the Islamic Republic. So I think this other aspect is very, very important. Mazahiri even calls it like a gigantic Islamic socialist NGO. To kind of describe the Basij. So I thought that it's another very important aspect of their system that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, no, as when I was reading about it, and in your work, what's interesting is that the same reference points that you provide for socialism, the CDRs, is what instantly came to mind. Like, oh, this is like a CDR, or just a regular Soviet.
Mm.
Um, can you talk a little bit? The third major institution you bring up is, of course, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRG.
Hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, its foundation, the social
Hmm.
role that it plays, and how it connects to the other two institutions, specifically the Basij, which you just talked about?
Yeah, so Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they're kind of like, they're sort of these elite units of the Iranian military, but they're not exactly the same as the Iranian military because they have a very explicitly ideological, you know, orientation. Um, and then the other thing that's important, how they relate to the Basij, is that a lot of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard were Basij in their youth. And then they got more military expertise and training, and they were promoted into the Revolutionary Guard. And the Revolutionary Guard is important because they tend to oversee and control a lot of Iran's vital infrastructure besides the oil industry. So roads, natural gas, railways, things like that. Um, so, and of course, there are many countries where the military plays some role in the economy. I think the difference is that the fact that they overwhelmingly come from a certain class strata and that they are trained very early on to be very ideologically committed to the ideas of the Islamic Revolution definitely makes this a rather interesting, aspect of Iran's economy. And the fact that they're placed in charge of infrastructure means that, it's like an additional insurance policy for the Islamic Republic to be secure against some kind of subversion or attacks on its infrastructure, which of course is something they're very concerned with, either at the hands of the U.S., at the hands of Israel, at the hands of separatist groups or terrorists like ISIS. This is very vital importance to their security. And the other reason that it's important to bring up Iran's Revolutionary Guards is because they played a vital role in some of the economic reforms that Iran has been through since 2004. Because in 2004, uh, there was this official commitment made under uh, to privatize parts of what they said were the state-run parts of the economy. But what's interesting is that a lot of the state-run enterprises were actually just transferred to control of the Revolutionary Guards. So, and in fact, Mazahiri makes the argument that a lot of the privatization initiatives between 2004, and at the time of the publishing, 2019, of so 15 years or so, that a lot of the privatization initiatives were actually not privatization at all. That a lot of the so-called privatization, only about less than 20% actually wound up in the private sector. And a lot of these sort of state-run enterprises were actually just transferred to control by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or the Basij. So it was really just a transfer of one form of state control to another form of state control. And I think that's really important because in some of the criticisms I saw, there was some criticisms I saw in my article. They were saying, well, how do you account for all these privatizations? But that is actually the kind of, quote, privatization, that occurred. So that's why I thought it was important to bring up the Revolutionary Guard. And the thing is, of course, when you see media coverage of Iran, you hear about the Revolutionary Guard a lot, but you don't hear very much about their economic role.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of China and the role similar institutions have played in developing the economy. Like when COVID hit, they were at the front lines building hospitals and the things necessary to deal with the crisis. How would you describe the contradictions right now that one can find in Iranian society? What are the class? What's the class character of the forces within Iran that are the most hostile to the revolution? And how is it that you know? I think you're gonna opt for saying at least one of them are the middle classes. How is it that their liberal worldviews often open the door for something you've called, and every time I use it, I quote you, woke imperialism, which is certainly evident in how the U.S. speaks about Iran.
Yeah. So in contemporary in Iranian politics in the last 20 years or so, there's been, broadly speaking, these two factions, and it's playing out also. I mean, there's since the president died in that crash, in the helicopter crash, it's playing out now. There are these elections actually in just 6 days, on June 28th. There's, so broadly speaking, there are these two main factions. There's the reformists and there's the principalists. So the reformists, so the principalists are, what the Western media calls hardliners, basically, right? And they are very strict, in terms of like being religiously conservative, supporting, religious laws, and supporting socially conservative legislation and restrictions, But the other side of it, though, is that they tend to be more for more state intervention in the economy. They tend to be very they often are opposed to neoliberalism, because they see those as possible openings of Western influence and threats to Iran's sovereignty. Now, on the other side, you have the reformists. And the reformists tend to be, sort of more liberal on cultural issues, wanting to lift more, restrictions on how people dress and, certain religious laws and things like that. But on the other hand, they are often proponents of free market reforms, and they want privatization, and they want more space for entrepreneurship and things like that. So the principalists, I mean, there are, obviously this is not cut and dry, but much of the support for the principalists or the so-called hardliners comes from the Iranian working class. Because the poor and the working class in Iran tend to be more religious, much more religious, and they also tend to support the more active role of the state because of their class position, they are dependent on the state for their survival. While a lot of support for the reformists comes from Iran's middle class, and this is confusing, I think, to a lot of Western leftist observers because they think that left-wing economic positions have to go along with liberal cultural positions, right? And that therefore being a conservative means on religious and social issue means that you also must be a proponent of free markets, and more libertarian stuff like that. Iran, complete opposite. Complete opposite. So that's why sometimes it's hard to understand Iran in a sort of a Western framework. Um, and the thing and the aspect that is um, also ironic is that this middle class, their existence is largely due to the Iranian Revolution, because they in 1979 only about 5% of Iran's population was middle class, and now it's expanded to about 34%. And a lot of that is due to the fact that you had all these university scholarships were provided to the family members of veterans of the war with Iraq. And this actually gave opportunity for people from poor and working class backgrounds to get an education and therefore ascend into the middle class and the more professional class in Iran. But this class has become a force that is hostile to the Islamic system, to the Islamic Republic, and it's a very serious problem because it's a source of serious instability. And one of the reasons that Iran is vulnerable is because this middle class element in their society is of the view that if Iran softens its anti-imperialist positions, particularly its support for Palestine, then the Western sanctions will be lifted or at least lessened, and that will provide more space for their middle class existence to thrive. And this obviously provides a sort of an opening for imperialism. This is a cleavage within Iranian society that U.S. imperialists exploit. And there are all sorts of American and European NGOs that are promoting and giving money to and encouraging this segment of Iranian civil society. There's hundreds of Persian language radio stations and internet outlets that are oriented toward this, this segment of Iranian society. And so the Islamic Republic is in a real bind because, on one hand, they won't have legitimacy if they don't continuously improve the living standards of the population. However, the middle class the growth of this middle class presents a problem because it's not, a lot of them are not supportive of the system, and that it's the real bedrock of loyalists to the Islamic Revolution is in the working class and in the poor. So it's a difficult situation, that Iran has found itself in, and it also is presents a division which Iran does not need, given that it's dealing with the U.S., it's dealing with threats from Israel. It has a lot of external threats, serious external threats on its plate. So it's very imperative that Iran find some way of peacefully as possible trying to resolve this internal contradiction, because Iran's now gone through several rounds of there being an election outcome that one side or another of this divide does not accept, and there being unrest and even violence. And so anyway, yeah. So this is a real ongoing issue, with Iran internally. And I'm not this is the thing. I'm not saying that these sort of divisions are created by the imperialists. It's not the point I'm making. I'm just saying it's an internal contradiction in Iranian society, class contradiction in Iranian society, which the imperialists and foreign powers exploit, because they'll exploit anything, any sort of cleavage or division in a society that they're trying to undermine, in some way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. How would you reply to those parts of the U.S. left, even so-called communist left, who base their assessment of Iran on a more two-day party line. How would you read the sort of contradictions between Iranian communists today and the the Islamic Socialist republic that we've been discussing today?
Yeah, I wanted to really, focus on that particular topic because it deserves its own answer. Um, the Tudeh Party, the Tudeh Party is a very important organization in Iran's modern history, and um, and I think it had a real, it had a real impact on the intellect on Iranian intellectuals throughout much of the 20th century. Um, the problem, the problem, the and Mazahiri kind of goes into some of this in his book about Iranian socialism. The issue with the Tudeh Party is that they never had a large. I mean, they at the time of the Iranian Revolution, they lacked a real working class base. They were always a relatively small party. At the time in 1979, they didn't have more than 5,000 members, and it was mostly intellectuals and students. So while they did have effect on the intellectual discourse, when the revolutionary moment occurred, they didn't have a real working class backbone, to take advantage of the situation, which meant that they were out in the cold. And the Islamists managed to build a mass working class base, and they didn't. And part of the reason is that the Shia Muslim populists were able to, when they did talk about class and they did talk about economic and social injustice, they were able to talk about it in this religious discourse that the common person in Iran understood. And it was very culturally relevant to them. And it had been culturally relevant to them for centuries. And what really worked against the Tudeh Party was the fact that, one, they were associated with atheism, which did a huge turnoff to a very religious population. And then the other thing, too, is that Iran had mostly been bullied by the British. But there was also a history of Iran getting bullied by Russia. And Russia had at various times tried to assert its influence in Iran. And the fact that the Tudeh Party was so close to the Soviet Union, it made them an object of suspicion. It made there was this huge upsurge of anti-foreign feeling and this desire to purge Iran of all foreign influences. And unfortunately, Marxism got lumped in as a foreign influence. And because they didn't have roots in the working class, it was very easy for the clerics and the Islamists to portray them as this, this foreign force. I think it's very tragic because terrible things were done to the Tudeh Party. They were repressed, they were imprisoned, a number of them were tortured, they were executed. I am not defending what happened. It was a terrible thing that happened. It was very traumatic. And I feel for the people who may have gone through that, So but I think it's relevant to us, to think about the consequences of, you can be a Marxist party, you can have some very good ideas, but if you don't have that working class, base in a time of revolutionary crisis, the consequences can be very, very harsh, but that's, so there's the Tudeh Party. And I just want to add this too. There's another communist group, though, that also should be mentioned. And I think this is in a totally different category from the Tudeh Party. And it's called the People's Mujahideen of Iran, or also known as the MEK. And they're a very strange group because they started out as this Islamic Marxist group that was fighting against the Shah. They were engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Shah in the 1960s and 70s. But then after the 1979 revolution, they turned against the clerics, they turned against the Islamic government, and then they fought on the side of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, basically with Saddam, on the side of Saddam. And they increasingly degenerated into this group that that lost its connection with the Iranian masses and basically became, mercenaries against their own country. And they killed thousands of Iranians, including Iranian civilians. So in that situation, it makes sense that the Islamic Republic repressed them very harshly, because they were effectively had become a foreign, a foreign supported force, and then ever since then, the MEK has, I mean, literally just become a complete CIA cutout. I mean, John Bolton is one of their biggest supporters now. I mean, they're completely just this proxy force that exists to destabilize Iran. So to me, it's when you hear these things being said about the Islamic Republic repressing communists, it's like, okay, well, which ones? Tudeh Party, I think that was completely unjustified. People's Mujahideen of Iran, a lot more gray area. You know, so I think that that sort of there isn't enough nuance when talking about this. And just because I'm saying Iran is a form of socialism doesn't mean that I agree with a lot of things the government has done. You know, so I just thought I would explain that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It seems like I mean, you mentioned that part of the failure of the Tudeh party uh, can be seen in its inability to really grab a hold of the masses, whereas the other forces were able to succeed in that. And I think that in conjunction with like the sort of foreign character that the Iranian people might have seen in the Tudeh party because of its connection to the Soviet Union, I think perhaps conjoined to that, or much more important than it, is an ability to articulate the class struggle, its development, and socialism in terms that are operative within the lexicon of the common sense of the people. And I think that's something that the clergy might have been a lot more successful in, because it's part of those institutions that have become the organizations for deriving the common sense of the people. But it shows us a lesson in the importance of rejecting national nihilism and being able to give socialism a national form, socialism as the concept that obtains a national form. Because if they had been able to tap into the progressive components in Islam, uh, it I think that perhaps it would have been much more successful in its enterprise of grabbing a hold of the masses. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a very complicated topic, and there's whole books written about it. And maybe just the objective alignment of forces was against the Tudeh party, and there was nothing they could do about it. And I don't know. I really don't know. But I will just say that the fact remains is that at the time of the revolution in 1979, they were not in a position. There was no scenario in which they were in a position to take power. To
Right.
think that they were like the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917 or the communists in China in 1949, which had huge mass bases, a huge mass base of support among workers and or peasants. It's just not an analogous situation. I would also like to say too that uh, that I mentioned that there were clergy that sort of um, that understood that. I mean, there's this one. His name is Mahmoud Talagani. He's a major cleric in the Iranian Revolution, who actually debated with Iranian Marxists in prison. He was imprisoned, for opposing the Shah. He was imprisoned along with the Marxists, and he debated them, and he even and he
Is that the Red
seriously
Mullah?
the Red Mullah, yeah,
Red
that was
Mullah.
his nickname, yeah. And he wrote this whole book called that's available online called Islam and Ownership, where he engages with Marxism quite seriously. And he, for religious reasons, he rejects dialectical materialism. He rejects, certain, aspects of it that are atheistic and reject, divine agency. But then at the same time, he argues for national and collective ownership of natural resources and other important parts of the economy, collective ownership. And he says this is compatible with the Quran, and he quotes parts of the Quran to support that statement. So, there is this cross pollination between particularly Shia Muslim populism. And the reason for that in particular, if you would allow me to make a little segue for this, is because um, to recap for people who don't know this sort of division between Sunni and Shia, and I'm not Muslim. I'm not, I'm not making any judgments about anyone's beliefs. I'm just explaining why, this emerged. But there was, it goes back to basically the 7th century, where goes back to one of the first caliphs of Islam, Ali, who was the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. So after Muhammad died, after the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, died, there was a dispute among Muslims about who would succeed Muhammad, be the successor to Muhammad. And so there were some Muslims who said that a conclave of religious scholars and others should decide who should be the caliph. And Ali, who was the son-in-law of the Prophet, argued that no, it should be a direct descendant of the Prophet. And so the Sunnis, who became the majority, said it should be done by this sort of consensus of these religious scholars, and then the Shia were the minority faction who argued for direct descent of the Prophet. And Ali was the caliph for a couple of years, and he was kind of, and this is where the relevance to socialism comes in. He was kind of a populist. He advocated the redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor. He made criticisms of the aristocracy, of the Arab aristocracy. He thought that the fruits of the conquests of Islam should be redistributed to all believers, and not just Arabs, and not just certain Arab families. And so he was assassinated, and there was a civil war amongst Muslims. And then his son Hussein, a number of years later, again made a claim to being caliph, and he actually raised a rebellion against this caliph who was considered illegitimate, Yazid, and he was killed in a very bloody battle. And Shia Muslims, these are martyrs for Shia Muslims, and Shia Islam, the interpretation of Shia Islam became the predominant strain in Iran, which is unusual because most Muslim countries are Sunni. But as just from this very brief explanation, there's a really interesting populist undercurrent, in this particular interpretation. And a number of religious scholars talked about the fact that that Shia Islam was a minority interpretation of Islam, and the fact that they were often out of power and persecuted by Muslim rulers gave that interpretation of Islam a particular appeal among the lower classes and the poor, the oppressed. So, and Imam Hussein, even there's many passages where he talks about the necessity of rebelling against corrupt and exploitative and unjust rulers, even if such a course of action looks hopeless, that it is a religious duty to do so. It's basically an Islamic version of its right to rebel, So there's tons more I could say about this, but I'm just trying to explain it. Even if you don't agree with these views, the point is that many tens of millions of people do believe them, and they're very deeply rooted religious traditions. And so there is this overlap between this kind of populism and socialism. They're not these completely incompatible ideas. And even if it's not called socialism, a lot of the essence is there. And not just in Iran, actually. I should add that Iraq has a very well-established communist party. And the main strongholds of the Iraqi communist support are in the south of Iraq, where the Shia majority lives. And in fact, Nasiriyah and Najaf, which are the two, some of the two holiest cities of Shia Islam, that's where Ali and Hussein are actually buried. they have actually elected communist politicians to represent them. There is this overlap, even though they have been repressed at times. There is at the same time this ideological and political overlap. So this like complete barrier that a lot of Westerners assume between the religious and the secular is not cut and dry. So anyway.
No, that's beautifully stated. It reminds me of some of the comments that our friend Haz recently made on Twitter, describing some of the overlaps of the tradition of the prophets and communism. Both Islam and Judeo-Christianity have in many ways values that are not just incompatible with the capitalist form of life, but in many ways only realizable in a socialist form of life. And I mean, there's many documents that can confirm that Marx and Engels also came to realize similar things. There's a letter where Marx is asked, "Where has communism worked?" And he says, "Go read the letters of St. Paul." It's very interesting. But one of the things you mentioned earlier in our discussion was that because of the interesting conjuncture of the '79 revolution, they were on one side anti-West and in a sense anti-capitalist, right? Anti-Western, but also they had tinges of anti-communism because they also saw it as a sort of foreign influence. I think that's something that has very much, at least in the international arena, changed. One of the major trading partners for Iran is China. Another major trading partner for Iran is Venezuela. It has excellent relations with basically all of the socialist and communist parties in power around the world. So how would you see you mentioned in a comment that, the '79 revolution in part was anti-communist. Do you think that's still the case? And is there any reflection of that affinity that has been developing over the last 2 decades with socialist states? Is any of that being reflected nationally?
Well, I will say that I mentioned that in the 2000s how Iran moved to the left economically under Ahmadinejad, at least his first term. But Iran also moved to the left in international relations because it was in the later 2000s, that Iran really deepened its relations with Venezuela and the Bolivarian, camp in South America under Hugo Chavez. And so, there was so I would say that if nothing else, just pure pragmatism has pushed Iran in the direction of having to be in a good relationship with anti-imperialist forces all over the world. Venezuela, Cuba, they have very good relations with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and then now with the Belt and Road with China. So I think they said neither West nor East, but once they comprehensively rejected the West, I think a turn toward the East was kind of inevitable. And now Iran has joined the BRICS and is a very important player in the Belt and Road. And so I think that I think also the rise of the Belt and Road couldn't have come at a better time for Iran, because in terms of this contradiction that's going on, this internal class contradiction, a way that they can kind of get around this conundrum they're in, which is intensified by the sanctions, which are strangling them economically, is to integrate further into the rising Eurasian economy. So they don't have to compromise on their economic and political system, but at the same time, they can bring in material prosperity that will both satisfy and enlarge the middle class, but not necessarily a middle class, but cultivate a middle class that is not necessarily pro-Western over time, because they're turning toward the East, they're turning toward China, they're turning toward Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I think, and I think the other thing that's changed is that, the Soviet Union was very, very overt, was very in your face about being not religious, and that definitely was a huge turnoff to them. But I think something that's notable about 21st century socialism is it's become much more relaxed with regards to its attitude toward religion. I mean, Bolivarian socialism is obviously very Christian in character. Um, Cuba has become much more tolerant of the church, of the church. Even China has done a lot to make communism more compatible with Confucianism and traditional Chinese religion, and so on. Um, so I think in that sort of international situation, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. There's a very interesting actually essay written by a high-ranking member of the Politburo of Ansarullah, the Houthis, and we're obviously aligned with Iran. And he made the observation that a lot of Muslims were mobilized against communism during the Cold War because communism was godless and so on. And he makes many went to fight in the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. But he basically makes the observation um, that while Marx did write things against religion, it was actually a relatively small part of his work, and that most of his work is obviously about denouncing the exploitation and the injustice of capitalism, and that in reality, it's proven that liberal capitalism is far more hostile to the Muslim world than socialism has ever been. You know, so even though there are obviously differences with historical materialism and so on, there's far less of them than with liberal capitalism, and that and so therefore I think that with the realization that the liberal hegemony is the true enemy and is the true threat to one's sovereignty, that can overcome a lot of ideological and cultural barriers. That's how I see it.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. We've talked on this channel with Roland Bohr, who's one of the most prominent Marxist-Leninist scholars on the question of religion. I want to say he's got well over 10 books on the subject, and I mean it's clear that religion, like everything else, has been pervaded by contradictions, and at its best, the Marxist tradition has been able to tease out the rational kernels and understand those areas of compatibility with religion. Now, religion, in many instances, whether it's Christianity or Islam, has not just been a pacifying force. It's sometimes worked as a force that has given people the courage and the lexicon through which to think about the injustices that they have suffered and how to struggle against those. And I couldn't agree more that 21st century communism is coming more and more into a position of awareness as to the positive components within religion. Um, I wanted to ask perhaps one final question. Iran is, of course, one of the major pillars, one of the major poles of this rising but still embryonic multipolar world. It's hard to describe it as being fully here when, of course, it's been over the last 8 months a genocide chronicled for all of us to see in our phones. But it's coming out, right? It's in the process of being born, and Iran is one of the major players in it. It's also perhaps if not one of the major players in the axis of resistance, one of the most important nodal points in which this new world is being born. Of course, the axis of resistance against the Zionist entity and supporting the Palestinian struggle. So, what role do you see Iran playing in this developing multipolar world?
I think an extremely vital role because I don't. I know that Saudi Arabia and UAE have also recently joined the BRICS, but I think they are doubtful allies of the multipolar project at best. I think the thing with Iran is Iran has a very, because of its particular history, has a very serious commitment to the defeat of US imperialism in West Asia, and also to opposition to the Zionist regime. And if it were not for, and I think this is important to understand in context, is, for 20 odd years, the bastion of anti-Zionism in the Middle East was Egypt, was Nasserist Egypt. But then, Nasser died in 1970, and then Sadat signed the Camp David Accords, which basically sold out the Palestinian cause. And one by one, many of the Arab states abandoned the Palestinians, abandoned and even moved toward normalizing with Zionism. And so the Iranian Revolution came just at this time when this united Arab front against Zionism was collapsing, was fracturing. And so over the last 45 years, Iran has built up its own network of alliances against Zionism and against US imperialism. And so it can be quite frankly said that whatever you think of their system, whatever you think of theocracy, and whatever you think of, certain religious views, the fact remains is that if it were not for Iran, the Zionists and US imperialism and their sectarian Wahhabi and Salafi proxies for the Gulf monarchies would completely dominate all of West Asia. And West Asia is the bridge between much of Asia and Africa, which is an essential part of building the Belt and Road and the new multipolar world order. So I think Iran is, and also in addition, Iran guards the southern flank of Russia and the western flank of China. If the Islamic Republic were to fall, both Russia and China would be in a much more vulnerable position than they are now. So I think Iran is of absolutely crucial importance, and it is the backbone of the resistance axis. The Palestinian armed groups, Hezbollah, Ansarullah, the various groups in Syria and Iraq, the only powerful state that they have on their side is Iran. And when Iran carried out those missile strikes on Israel in April, they pretty comprehensively demonstrated they're the only powerful country in the region that is not afraid of the Zionists and is willing to resist them, despite their appalling brutality and out of control aggression in the region. So I think that I think that Iran is playing an absolutely central role in building a multipolar world order, and also making giving the Palestinian cause a fighting chance, because without a powerful state ally, I think the Palestinians would be in a very, very, they're in a dire situation now, but they would be in a hopeless situation if they did not have a powerful regional ally, on their side. So I think that, for people who consider themselves radicals and revolutionary and anti-imperialists, and consider themselves to be in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, which is very important, need to develop more of an understanding of the resistance axis, and understand more Iran, which is the backbone of that resistance axis, and how they have patiently over 40 years managed to create a regional alliance that is able to strain the genocidal Zionist project to possibly a breaking point. So I think it's very important that solidarity with Palestine has to also come hand in hand with an understanding of solidarity with all these forces in the region that are in solidarity with Palestine and are directly supporting the Palestinian resistance.
I couldn't agree more, man. I one of the things we always try to emphasize is the fact that multipolarity is not something that's disconnected from the global class struggle. It's not disconnected from. It's not something communists can afford being indifferent to.
Right.
Multipolarity is the form that the global class struggle is taking, and the forces that are aligning with multipolarity are aligning themselves with the movement of history forward. They're aligning themselves with progress, and again, that's what communists should be doing. You know, they're the folks that follow through with, you know, that communists are the people that are embedded in the real movement of history that abolishes the present state of things. And Iran is one of the central players, in this construction of a new world. So it obviously stands, irrespective of how we think of left or right in terms of social morality. It stands very much on the left. It stands as one of the most progressive forces in the world today. So, Marius, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I learned a lot from your article and from this discussion. I have a few things written down to read afterwards. Marius also, at the end of the article, which I'm going to be linking in the comments, and it's linked already in the comments of the YouTube video, he also has a suggested reading list that people can go check out. To the 1,500 people watching us now, Marius, are there any parting words you would like to give? Any place where people can follow your work? Anything you'd like to plug?
I'm very modest. I'm just a contributor to the Midwestern Marx Institute. If you have any questions, you can email me at all lowercase trottermarius@gmail.com, and I also have a Instagram account which I use also from time to time. And yeah, I mean, I would just encourage people to I've never tried to present myself as some kind of like grand expert on this topic. There are people way more qualified than me, but I wanted to write this article as as a sort of a provocation and a way to instigate discussion about what socialism really does look like in our world in the 21st century, and to not get bogged down in in dogma and try to look at various phenomena with new eyes. And something does not have to fit into this rigid ideological box for something to be, in my view, truly revolutionary and something that is worth our solidarity. So that's all I have to say about that.
Beautifully said. Remember, we're Marxists. We analyze things not just at the level of what it says about itself, but at the level of material reality. So I think this is a beautiful way to end it. Thank you so much, Marius, for coming on and teaching us all. Thank you to the 1,500 plus people who have seen, and to the many others that will continue to see this program. And we'll sign out, as we have the last few months, with our beautiful, modernized, Americanized, folky version of the International, which I've promised the last 2 weeks will post on its own, and haven't yet. We will definitely get that done this weekend. So we'll see you all, folks. And Marius, stick around so we can talk a little bit after. But we'll see you all after the International. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no right. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, now they must give. And end the vanity of nations, we've but one earth on which to live. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama, in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbowed before their armor, we defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired by life and love. For though they offer us concessions, change will not come from above. So come brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in a song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal